Will you pray with me? Holy Sovereign, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts bring us closer to enacting your vision of heaven on earth by your grace. Amen. May I begin by thanking our pastors, Robin and Zach, for the amazing privilege of standing in this pulpit this morning. I am mindful that week after week, we hear an amazingly gifted proclamation of the word. Amen? Amen. So to step into this pulpit is to attempt to fill great expectations. Not only that, you do not know my husband Chuck and me, even though we feel like we know you. We've been attending First Church Sterling for about 9 months. A lot of that time attending on Facebook Live due to our family's compromised immunity. But we've read everything we could get our hands on and watched every worship service we couldn't attend in person. And we appreciate all we see of our pastors and people and lay leadership in this place who have worked so hard to widen the circle of welcome, to expand the circle of love. You know that does not happen everywhere, don't you? Because our God is an invitational God, not a coercive God. God's expansive love lures. It does not force itself on any faith community. Hence, all the places that sell hate in God's name, or mere complacency in God's name. Not this place where we declare each week that in the love of truth and in the spirit of Jesus, we unite for the worship of God and the service of humankind. Or as our pastors put it, create a bit of heaven on earth. Which I hope we all recognize as a huge step, a revolutionary step away from the bigotry and the banality that binds so much of the American church in the 21st century. So will you join me in giving God and God's people in this place a round of applause for the widening circle of love that continues to be accomplished in this place? We applaud knowing we always have more to learn, more to accomplish. Hence, we turn now to this revolutionary Jesus that many of us are curious about and many others have pledged to follow. I suspect that most of us were attracted to him not for his revolutionary message, but for his compassion. For his compassion, yes? Which is why I find the story of Jesus that we read for this morning so disturbing. In fact, it's kind of a strange story for Jesus to tell. It's a story that doesn't seem quite like Jesus at all. I mean, we all know that Jesus is always on the side of the underdog, yes? On the side of the weak, on the side of the hurting. And in this season of tough guys invading tiny countries and meanness outweighing kindness on every social media outlet and on too many street corners and in high school bathrooms, we need Jesus, Lord of compassion. Amen? It's a part of why we like him so much. Little people, oppressed people, people who have been hurt and wounded, Jesus lifts them up. There was a woman who was widowed and had just a penny to her name because of a social system that kept her from honestly earning or owning anything. Remember her? There were the children. There were the poor, the unclean, the so-called sinners. All of these, Jesus would make heroes of his stories. The oppressed and misunderstood, the minority Samaritan traveler, the teenager who messed up and ended up in the most shameful place for a kid in his culture, a pigsty. The workers in the vineyard who, because they were picked last, only got to put in 1 hour's labor. That handicapped beggar at a rich man's gate. Jesus was always lifting up the wounded, the hurt, the misunderstood, the underdog, which is why it's so confusing and disturbing that in this story, it's the wounded, the misunderstood, the underdog that he turns on with judgment, especially since it's an underdog who just as easily could have been me, and maybe you too. Excuse me. Jesus tells the story of 3 servants. And in the beginning, this story has all the elements of a fable with a little moral lesson at the end. There were once 3 servants, and one was given a great big bag of money, and one was given a medium-sized bag of money, and the third was given a small bag of money. And you and I know how these stories go, always. 3 bears, 3 brothers, 3 sisters, or 3 little pigs. It's always the last, the smallest, the youngest, the least who gets it right, right? But here, Jesus turns the table. He picks on the little guy, says that he's lazy and has him fired. Now, does that sound like our Jesus of the underdog? The Jesus of compassion for the wounded. The Jesus of second and third and 7 times 7 chances. Now, I suspect that I know why Jesus told it that way, but before we go any further, I need to clarify something. There are those who want to read this parable as a fable with a little moral lesson in the end, and when they do, the master ends up being God, and we are warned not to be like the third servant, lest God throw us into outer darkness. Let me make myself clear. I will not worship a God or be a part of a church that worships a God who throws hurting people into outer darkness. And I do not think Jesus did or does either. Amen. So have patience with me and with our compassionate Jesus for a bit to see what else he might be trying to teach us this morning. I suspect it might have something to do with the fact that most of us do not see ourselves as revolutionary heroes. Oh, we see a Ukrainian President, Vladimir Zelensky, and the Ukrainian people fighting for their freedom, and we see their heroism, but most of us don't think of ourselves as that in that way. If you're like me, you're much more likely to relate to one of those funny superpower memes. You know, like, my superpower is meeting new people and then instantly forgetting their names. You see, most of us think of ourselves not as revolutionary or heroic, but as ordinary and average, or sometimes even wounded and broken. To use the language of the parable, we are the 1 talent people, or 2 talents if we're lucky, and brave enough to share them. We notice that there are others, a few special people who have much more impressive resources than we seem to have. We notice that history seems to swing upon what they do and do not do. But as for many of us, we're fairly ordinary. Our lives are everyday and average, and we don't make much difference in the large scheme of things. We're just here among millions of other people in the world doing our little thing, right? Jesus comes to us today to say, That's not so. Jesus says, in my story, it is you 1 and 2 talent people who make all the difference. This story is about you. There are the 5 talent people, the Mozarts, the Da Vincis, the Lin-Manuel Mirandas, the Ariana Du Boises, the Vladimir Zelenskys, but frankly, they're rare. And the vast majority of the world, including me and maybe including a bunch of you, we are the 1 or 2 talented people, or maybe even 5 talented people who have been wounded or pushed down or ignored. We are the ones who this parable is about. And Jesus claims that the story of God and God's creation will have its ending determined most of all by what we do with our lives. I don't know if the visionary Trabian Shorters is familiar with this parable, but given his background, having been raised in the church, I suspect he knows it well. You may recognize his name in the same way I was made aware of his work through the brilliant work of Krista Tippett's On Being in a podcast that dropped February 3rd of this year. Trabian Shorters has made it his life's work to change the way we talk about our lives, especially the way we talk about the lives of the least of these, to talk about those of us who have been victimized by systems or by violence or by medical conditions. Mr. Shorters has made it his life's work to change our language, to stop us from framing identity around deficits or wounds, and instead to frame our identity and provide assistance in our culture based on what he calls asset framing. He identifies asset framing as this: it is defining people by their aspirations and their contributions before you get to their challenges. So whatever is going on in someone's life, you don't ignore it, but you don't define them by the worst moment or the worst experience or the worst potential. None of that. You have to look past their faults to see who they really are. And even the word aspiration, we're very intentional about that because it has the word spirit baked into it. Now, doesn't that sound like what Jesus both wants and needs from us? To get beyond what has limited us, to find our best gifts? Whatever hardships are happening in your life right now, and God knows the world is giving us many. Whatever setbacks you have suffered, whatever wounds still weep within you, God's compassion is there weeping with you. But also know this: when God looks at you, God sees so much more than your hardships and setbacks and wounds. God sees your humor and your strength and your resilience. God sees beyond any mistakes and missteps to see your aspirations for yourself and for this world and for this community. And it is that child of God, that beautiful, strong, gifted child that God is calling to today, begging you not to bury your gifts in the ground or to hide them in the safety of your shame and shyness, but to bring them out into the light where the world can be blessed and made more beautiful by them. In this time of stewardship, the church is asking for a portion of your money, yes, but the church also needs those beautiful, lovely aspirations. Won't you share them with us? Amen. Amen.